Hi, and welcome to Connected Conversations for Creatives, a place for creatives like you to learn, grow, and connect. On this journey we call life, we often find ourselves at different crossroads along the way, faced with choices that shape our futures. It's at these crossroads where we may question whether we've lived too much or perhaps not enough just to be able to chase our dreams. We're haunted by doubts that whisper, is it too late or am I too young? And the journey might not be easy, but it's in those challenges that we find the true essence of who we are and that we're capable of achieving anything we set our minds to. From the vast horizons of the sea to the weaving of intricate threads and words, the story of today's guest reminds us the pursuit of our dreams knows no boundaries. In a world fixated on age and societal expectations, he chose to rewrite his narrative, embarking on a creative journey later in life. He embraced the blue-collar poet label bestowed on him by his classmates because of his years in the Navy and later working as an electrician on oil tankers, naval vessels, and fishing boats before he returned to college at the age of 37. His voyage wasn't without challenges, but the beauty of his many successes lies in his audacity to dare, to dream, and to disrupt the confines of time. If you, my friends, are wrestling with doubts about the timing of your dreams or whether your past has left you too weathered or too inexperienced, I encourage you to listen to the words of the experienced. Hear the call to cast aside those shackles and step into the realm of possibility, for dreams are not bound by age or lived experiences. They're fueled by passion, resilience, and the courage to believe that what you want is within reach, regardless of where you are on life's continuum. So please welcome to today's show, writer, teacher, father, and award-winning poet, Bill Cushing.
Oh, thanks so much, Jennifer. And I have to start right away by saying I think I'm going to have to hire you as my publicist for my next book. That was a great introduction. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. I'm so excited and just thrilled to death that you are here.
Well, and I find it interesting that you talk about the idea of crossroads and things like that. Of course, mine is my decision to go to school, and like I said, I just finished a memoir about that journey. It's now in revision. I don't expect it'll be out for some time, but it actually comes out of I host a writing group here, or well, online now. And one of the women in the group went, well, how does a guy go from being an electrician in the Navy to being a college English professor? And I was like, well, kind of a weird story, but here you go. And that kind of led to this book, which, like I say, I finally finished, but needs some major work. But I have to confess that my impetus was very basic. It was I wanted to keep living, and working as I did, I realized after some, and I loved the work. I that's one of the things I always said. I loved when I got in the Navy and I became an electrician. I absolutely loved the work. Of course, I came from a background. My dad was an electrical engineer. I'd worked in his shop several years. Uh, I was always fairly good with my hands. But when I got into it, I always loved the work. I was like, to me, it was like I was a kid working on a full-scale model. But I had two incidents that made me realize that, this is a dangerous job, and eventually something bad's going to happen. And the longer you wait for it to happen, the worse it's probably going to be. So it seemed like that I hit one part, and I said, it's a good idea maybe to look at something else now. And I had a friend, and she was always saying, you got to go back to school. You got to, you love talking about books and history and movies and music and all this stuff. You got to teach. I was like, yeah, but I'm happy where I am. I like the work. And then when I say these two events occurred, I said, well, maybe she's got a point. So, but that led to me going back to school. And I actually had not thought of writing to begin with, even though I always enjoyed it. I loved reading. I kept journals. Initially, I was going to go major in history and hopefully teach, because I'd always enjoyed history, and I always found it. And one of the interesting things there is, and I even tell my students now, I say, anybody who is bored by history classes, it's not the subject matter, it's probably the teacher. So,
Mhm.
um,
Yes, I agree.
yeah, because I was always lucky. I think I only had one bad history teacher in my whole life, and that was like my senior year in high school. And by that time, I'd figured out enough. Well, it's him. It's not the topic. I just
Mhm.
need to get through this class, and I'm done with it. But every history teacher I've had has been, first rate to me. Plus, growing up, I was a member of the Cold War Navy, and growing up in that time, during the Cold War, the height of it, I recall not vividly, but of course, I do have memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis and those things. So I was looking at Russian history as a major, and but I got into school, and then one of the first English instructors I had kind of wrote me into the writing. I mean, he liked what I was producing in his class, and he talked me into, hey, why don't you come work for me on the school newspaper? Um, and I was like, yeah, but what do I know about that? He says, well, there's scholarships. I said, well, I do know I like money and I'm mercenary. So that sounds good. And then he eventually wrote me into, by the time I got out of there, I was the editor of the literary magazine, the newspaper. I was working on festivals and things like that. So just suddenly got into the writing. Uh, the poetry is a whole different thing, and I'll dovetail off that because
Yeah.
here again, if you had told me when I was 30, even 35, that you were going to be writing poetry, I would say, no, you're nuts. That's not going to happen. Well, I went to a journalism conference for the school paper, and there was a seminar on how to improve your writing. And I go, and the woman giving the seminar says, it's real simple, write poetry. And she goes into this, and it wasn't a very long talk, actually. She just basically said, look, poets are by nature looking for economy and looking to pack as much imagery into every word that they can. So if you can write even bad poetry, it's going to make whatever else you write better. I was like, I'd never thought of that. And before that weekend was out, I had my first notes for a poem, and that sort of took off from there. I was like, this is great stuff. I'm really enjoying it. So,
Wow. I have very little real experience writing what would be considered poetry. Like I tried my hand at it, especially when I was younger, and it's really funny. Like it was trash. Like it was it was like the younger, like don't ask me to read it to you. It will never happen. It will never see the light of day again. But the current book that is working towards publication, the main female character is an author, and with that
oh,
she writes a lot of poetry.
okay.
And there were points at which I thought, okay, I'm going to incorporate some old classic poems and that kind of thing, just because, like,
Mm,
as chapter transitions and that kind of thing. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, no, I want it to be as authentic as possible. And so I tried my hand at it, and
oh,
gave it a shot. And I was actually pretty good. I felt like it was pretty good, but it requires so much, in my experience, introspection. Almost like
mhm.
you really have to look inside before you can start writing outside. And I was like, I don't know if this will
That's
become
all
part
right.
of my regular repertoire, but it
Yeah.
was kind of an interesting experience.
Yeah, and even though I've now returned to an earlier memoir I'd written originally and had put away because it dealt with before my marriage. Now I was married to a woman who died of cancer, and I'd
Mm.
written about that, and I'm returning to that book now and hoping to get that out. Um, but yeah, I'm sort of leaning into prose now. Um, although but still writing the poetry quite
Mhm.
regularly. I belong to a group. We meet once a week, although I'm not regular. But whenever I feel I have something that I'd like to workshop, I join in and I get feedback from these people. Um, but yeah, I enjoy the discipline of it. And one of the things I've been doing lately, well, when I say lately, this is maybe over the last 5 or 6 years, is trying to do some of the formal styles. Uh, Sonnets, odes, madrigals. I've really gotten hooked into some of the Japanese
Mm.
structures. Uh, but and the what is it? The decima, the oviedo. These are some Spanish styles of writing. And I've been having fun with that because it's like, okay, I've sort of proven I can do the freestyle stuff. Let me see what happens when I put, pull in on the reins a little bit and say, okay, you've got to do this to make the thing work. And it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's poetry to me, like, I don't understand it. I don't have a
Yeah.
background in it, so I never really truly studied it. And to try to remember like high school where they went through all the different kinds of poetry, that's
Mhm.
probably over my head. So what distinguishes poetry, like, for you or just in general? I don't know. Come at it from the teacher perspective and
Oh,
tell us
one of
like
my
what.
favorite,
Yeah, go
one of my
for it. Make it
favorite
happen.
topics, because that's once I got involved in it, and once again, I'm coming out of a very restricted background myself, and and even when I teach writing now, and generally like freshman comp and things like that, uh, I tell my students, look, I'm assuming most of you just want to learn the craft. And I'm really big on definition. I say define everything. If you don't know what you're talking about, what's the point of talking about it? And that was once I got roped into it, I just started looking around. How would you define poetry? And it's a very elusive thing. And I was reading all these people, and I got to meet. I got to meet Philip Levine, Carolyn Forche, Gwendolyn Brooks. I mean, some very big name poets, and they all gave me some pretty good working definitions, I thought. I love Levine. So his definition of inspiration was where you get so zoned into the work that it becomes effortless.
Mm.
So he says inspiration is not something that comes from outside. It's just you yourself, like you say, bringing the inside out. Uh, but I have to say, the best definition of poetry I ever heard was a guy I happened to meet. It was on a cross country train ride. I was going from Vermont back down to Florida. And I met this guy who was from coming out of Canada. And just by chance, we discovered we both had an interest in reading and writing poetry. So we started talking. And I said, well, how would you define it? He says, to me, poetry is the history of the human soul. I was like, that's got to be the best definition I've ever heard,
Mm.
especially when you look literally, poetry started as history. If you look at the epic poems of the Greeks and this sort of thing, that poetry was the record of events, but also blends in with John Gardner, the American novelist, always said that the job of the writer is not to necessarily break new ground, but to find new ways to convey what he called immutable truths
Mm.
for his own generation. So yeah, and I said, yeah, that's a good explanation of it, because what do my poems reflect is my own individual interpretation of whatever it is, a moment, an image, an emotion, whatever the thing happens to be. But I can only do it from my point of view, which of course is affected by what? Well, the fact that I'm a male, white, who was born in such and such a year and grew up in such and such a place. And I'm a big believer in we're more products of environment than genetics. So there you go. So yeah, when I look at the poems, I think, yeah, this is my way of conveying to the reader. All right, this is how I saw it. Let me present it to you, and how do you see it? You know, uh,
Mm.
so yeah, it's an interesting art form in that it's always changing, only because each generation goes through different things. I mean,
That is a very interesting perspective on it. And in some of the pre-show conversation that we had, and just the information, like, you strongly believe that all writers should be involved in writing poetry in some form or fashion. Like, is that the discipline of it, or is it the
yeah,
introspection, or?
and I say it's that idea of like I'm doing now, where I'm trying these new, more formalized forms. And it's funny because sometimes they don't stay that way. My writing group a couple of weeks ago, I brought one in, and it was in a certain form, and one of the guys there said, you know what? He says, I think you should break the form. You've got what you want down now. Now make it something else, and I think you can do more with us. Yeah, it's okay, and that's happened too before. Where I've had, well, it's funny because I have had I had one poem. I lived for 3 years in Puerto Rico, and I had visited this person I knew up in the mountains there, and he lived in this. I swear it was like, well, I always love the story of Gabriel Garcia Marquez went to Puerto Rico one time, and of course he's known for his magic realism and these very otherworldly places. And when somebody asked him later, well, what was it like? He says, if I wrote about it, people would believe I was making it up. It's a very strange place. And the way this guy lived, I was like, this is such a cool setting. And I kept trying to write it as a poem, and it just wasn't working. Well, finally, I was working on a short story. And I thought, well, actually, the character in the story kind of fits in with Bobby's, the guy I knew, his personality. So I transported all that into the opening scene of the story. And I was like, God, it's working great. So, yeah, you never know where the poem's going to lead. But like that initial lecture I heard was, look, you're only going to make everything else you write better if you try and discipline yourself, you know, squeezing as much as you can out of every single word you use. It's going to make your own writing much more efficient and much better. So,
And I can see how that kind of process would also help an author who writes fiction novels or
mhm,
whatever to connect with the reader, like to engage more deeply with the
mhm,
reader, which is when I read, that's what I want. I want to be engaged to the point where I'm not having to interpret things, but at the same time I want it to touch me somewhere. So if you're
mhm.
writing poetry and it is definitely coming from the deepest essence of your soul, I could see how practicing that regularly would also make you a better
Yeah.
writer of fiction.
Yeah. It's funny because one of my favorite writers of the English language is Anthony Burgess. And of course, everybody knows him for Clockwork Orange, but I mean, the guy, I don't know how many novels he wrote, but um, he actually studied music. And he always said that's where he draws a lot of his ideas and inspiration for his fiction. And you can see it. I mean, and he does write. In fact, it's funny, during the lockdown, I was able to get to a lot of books I'd had sitting on shelves and not gotten to it. And one of them was he wrote a book on Moses, which is entirely in verse. And it was so wonderfully written. I mean, I was like, God, this is so good. Uh, but he also wrote what was the one? Oh, and he this was a fun one. He wrote a book called Napoleon Symphony, which is a fictionalized account of Napoleon, but he sections the book into four different parts, and he tries to fashion the writing in each section to correlate with the music of Beethoven's Third, which was his Napoleonic Symphony. And so he gets into some really interesting writing there. And you look at, I mean, if you've read Joyce, people like this, I mean, they weren't known as poets, but they've written in a very poetic manner, I think.
Yeah. And okay, so thinking about, his inspiration being music, I draw a lot of my inspiration. Music is huge for me. I'm a musician, and
Ah,
music is yeah, yeah, it's fun. Music is something that has always just, I mean, if we're not breaking into song around here, then something's wrong, kind of thing. So music is huge, and that's where I draw a lot of inspiration from. What about you? Where does your inspiration, like what's your biggest source of inspiration?
I think it's just people watching, just seeing what's
Mm,
around. Because I write a lot of my poems, especially, are about people, and obviously the people I've known come into play, but even people I haven't. I mean, one of my favorites is a about a guy I never met, but I dated his granddaughter, and she told me stories about him. I was like, this guy sounds so cool. And then she had a clipping from, he had done a local newspaper interview, and I'm reading. I said, this is. So I ended up writing this poem. It's called Clarence, which was his actual name, and it's about this retired farmer in Iowa who becomes a carpenter. And there you go. You talk about doing something later in life. This guy certainly did that. But but yeah, I've written several things where I didn't know the person, but just watching how they acted and trying to suppose, which of course is what most writers do. You try and get in the head of whatever character you're dealing with.
Oh yes, people are one of my favorite things to watch. We would literally, my husband and I, but when we first got married, broke as a joke, but we would go to the mall and sit on the
Mhm.
bench across from the escalator and watch people and just
Yeah,
kind of make up their stories as we
yeah,
sat there
yeah,
and watched them.
yeah. And that's something that I do. Yeah, I do that quite a bit, I think. Yeah, and like, well, in my last book, I just came out with a book of poems the beginning of this year, and one of the poems, and it was amazing how rapidly it came to me because as a writer, one of the things I'm really big on is rewriting. I just, you know, I always loved what a friend of mine said when I got involved in the poetry. This guy said one time, he says, writers are never satisfied, they just give up. Uh, you've looked at the thing so many times, you go, all right, I can't deal with it anymore. It's going as it is. And just, but and you talk about music, I work with a musician locally here when he's in town. He bounces between here and New York, but whenever he's in town, we try and set up gigs for the two of us to go perform. But we grew up across the street from each other. And I had not seen this guy. I went in the Navy in 70. That was the last time I saw it. And then in 19, no, God, what am I saying? No, wasn't that long ago. It was 2016. 2016. I learned he was in LA and I had a reading and I invited him out. And, I said, yeah, I just wrote him. I said, is this the same Chuck I grew up across the street from? He goes, oh, yeah, I'm out here now. I said, well, come on, I'm doing a reading for this book I'm in. And he came out. Well, afterwards, we sat down and just got caught up with each other. And at one point, he said to me, he says, what would you think of the idea of teaming up? And, I'm now a musician. That's what I majored in. And, I'll play music and you can read your poems. And I just told him, I said, Chuck, there's one thing you never do is you never ask a poet, do you want to read your stuff? Because the answer is always going to be yes. So bear in mind, you started this. It's all your fault. But yeah, we've been working together now. He's coming back into town. We're doing a thing in November. We're going to be at a literary festival, doing a semi-performance, semi-presentation. We did one a few months ago. So yeah, whenever he can make it in here, we arrange it. But well, I say he plays professionally, so he's always bouncing between LA and New York now. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. But yeah, you talk about the music. I mean, that's something that I can't play. I wish I could. I kick myself for not learning when I was younger. Uh, but I love, especially jazz
Mm.
is sort of my big thing. And I write a lot. I've written a lot. In fact, I have a book called Music Speaks, which is a collection of poems about music, primarily jazz. There's some classical and rock in there, but it's mostly Miles Davis, Nina Simone, uh, people like that. One about, I don't know if you know UB Blake, who was, I got to see him. And that's sort of what the poem is about is I go to a show with UB Blake and Alberta Hunter, and I'm looking at these two and I'm thinking, man, there's like 150 years of experience on this stage just in these two people. So
Oh my gosh, I love jazz.
mhm.
My kid loves jazz. It's one of those
That's
things that we
great.
just kind of pass down because and I started my very first instrument. We tried the piano. That was not for me. I didn't have the patience for it, but I grabbed a clarinet and because I wanted to be Benny Goodman, like I wanted to be Jenny
Ah,
Goodman. If
there
you
you
will, like
go.
I was like, he was my idol. I loved all things jazz. And
Oh,
so I just kind of moved instrument to instrument after that. But
mhm.
that's still my favorite. And one of my favorite gifts was my husband came home from a yard sale with a record player and a stack of like jazz records.
Oh,
Oh my
oh,
gosh.
that's great.
It's the
That's
best day ever.
I don't know if you ever heard of, speaking of that, to kind of veer off a bit, but Charles Lloyd did a recording. I think it's called Desert Flower. It's an old 1960s recording a little live show. I think he did it in the Village somewhere, but he's trying to make. He's got I guess it's a tenor sax, but he tries to make it sound like a clarinet. and he almost gets there. I mean, it's so fun. He never quite hits it, but it's like, this is amazing. I mean, this guy, and there you go too. I think that's, part of the writing is being daring, is, trying stuff that takes you out of your zone.
Yes. Yes. I'm not even going to lie. My favorite book review that I've ever gotten was one of the readers said, I went into this thinking one thing, but then
Hmm.
she broke all of the rules. And I was actually kind of glad to see it. And I was like, I didn't
That's,
realize that I had broken rules. I just wrote because it's what I had inside and that's what
yeah,
I wanted to come out. And she was
yeah.
like, she broke all the rules. And I was like, I am a rule breaker by nature. It is what it is. So
Which, by the way, leads me to one of the things I always tell people who are just starting writing, or or in writing. I say, always remember, when somebody sees something that you didn't put there, don't say I wasn't thinking of that. Just say, I'm glad you saw that.
I I like that. I've
Well, it's
got
kind of
a
like one of my standard answer, of course, when you walk into our place, there's bookshelves all over the place, and people will go, "Have you read all these books?" I just say some of them twice. Didn't say I read them all.
That's right. That's so accurate. I have so many books just on a list and in my Kindle and here and there. And it's like,
Yeah,
it's because I love them. I haven't met them yet, but I love
yeah,
them.
yeah. One day, I'm convinced it's what's going to keep me immortal. I'm just not going to run out of books to read.
That's right. I can't go anywhere yet. I haven't read all
Yeah.
my books. That's so funny. So let's talk about some of your achievements and the recognition that you've gotten. I know that, sometimes it's awkward to talk about yourself like this,
Yeah.
but you were named one of the top 10 poets in LA back in
Yeah,
2017,
I
which
think
is
2016, 17. Yeah,
okay. So that's
that was a
amazing.
real honor. I was like, I was so stoked when that happened. And I got to meet, and it was funny because I moved here in 96. Really didn't get involved until because all right, my wife and I had our son in 2001. Now I was active then, but I was sending out mostly to small mags and stuff like that. Not really that tapped into the local market so much. Although I did meet a couple of people. Uh, in fact, it was funny because one of the first people, I have to laugh at this. This is really neat. Um, my wife was from here, and I was living in Puerto Rico. We sort of did a long distance thing for a while. But what happened was she would fly out there for a vacation. I'd fly up here. Well, the first time I'm flying out here was for Thanksgiving weekend. And I brought some poems of my own to work on the flight. And I'm sitting there, in the plane, scratching some notes. And this woman sitting next to me, she's like, "Do you write poetry?" I said, "Oh yeah, this is mine." And we started. She goes, "Oh, I write poetry too." And so we started talking about that. And she goes, "Well, where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm meeting this woman I'm involved with, and she lives in Glendale." And she goes, "I live in Glendale." It turns out now she lives, I don't know, 2.5 blocks from us. But she was like my first connection into the LA poetry market, I guess. So she was a nice connection. But let's say what happened was our son was born in '01, very disabled, a lot of problems. And so I sort of put everything on hold for the first, well, till around 2014, 2015.
Mm,
So the first 10, 12 years of his life, a lot of therapies, just very busy with him. And I said,
mm,
okay, just put everything on hold for the moment. And then I started getting active again. And that's when Spectrum Publishing is the name of the group, when they were taking, uh, and I don't even recall if I knew what the topic was. They were just saying, send us 10 of your best. And I said, okay, let me try it out. And that's when I found out, oh, I got in the book, and, actually met some people that I now know, on a more personal level, having been tapped into it a bit. But that was really nice. Um, I think probably the one, and this is kind of funny because The one recognition that I really got off on was, and that would have been 2016 as well. I mentioned that I'd written a poem about Miles Davis. I wrote this poem right after when I learned of his death. Basically, I was at the university at the time, and I went into my bedroom that weekend and locked myself in my room with all my Miles Davis recordings and a bottle of whiskey, and just started drinking and taking notes, and which I always say attests to the inspiration of either Miles Davis or whiskey. I don't know which one was the bigger
It doesn't
factor.
matter, does it?
But I'd written this poem and I could never get it placed. I was like, I don't, I liked it. I was very happy with it. I kept looking, is there something I should change? Well, then in 2015, the call went out. There's a publisher out of Colorado was doing, and it was called Stories of Music. And they were saying, I said, we're looking for that. And I said, you know what? Let me try the Miles piece with this, but I'm going to try something different. Well, what happened was, in the original, there was an ending line that had a profanity. So, not knowing your audience, I won't say what it was, but at any rate, it was there. But I thought it fit and it worked and all that. I said, well, this looks like the kind of book that will probably go out maybe to schools. So let me change the line. She took it. I was like, and ever since then, I also got nominated for a push card on it. I was nominated for best of it. So that poem, ever since I changed that one word,
That's amazing.
has gotten me some really good mileage.
So what you're saying is that one word can make a huge difference.
Apparently it can. because and it was just, I said, oh, well, this looks like but the real charge was not just the fact that I got accepted, but that finally the poem got placed. And this is here again, I apparently hadn't paid that close attention to the call. I got paid $200 for it. I was like, and it was funny. I immediately called my old English teacher, because he and I have become the guy who got me started. We've become very good friends. We were actually fairly good friends while I was a student. Which I will say, one bad idea about that, though, was one time I took like 5 classes with a guy, and it turns out he was from Boston, I was from New York. We were about the same age, because I was older going back, and we'd both lived in Baltimore the same year, had been to the same places, so we hit it off very well. But one time I gave him a paper, and then we went out that weekend, and we're just out at a bar or something. And he goes, "Oh, by the way, I'm giving you your paper back. I want you to rewrite it." I said, "Well, why is that?" He says, "You didn't spend more than 10 minutes on that thing." I was like, "Oh, damn, you know me too well." Yeah, he said,
"Oh, yeah."
He said, "There's no reason I should spend more time grading it than you did writing it." So I was okay.
Oh, yeah. You
but
set that expectation way too high.
Yeah. But I called him when the poem got accepted, and I found out I was getting paid. He goes, "Man, he says, I've never been paid that much. So the most I ever got was $50." So I was like,
yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's funny now, I actually have to confess, I've become much more comfortable in that format of the poetry. And now I'm not sending out as often as I do. I'm now saying, you know what? I'm going to send where I get a paycheck. I think I've paid my dues enough, that I think my work should get compensated now. So, except for a few places, like I say, there's a couple of people who published me early on that, were like Spectrum. He doesn't pay, but it's like, okay, but, I'll send to him because he helped me get started, that kind of thing. But, and obviously I have some friends, once again, branching out into the market a little bit. Like there's a guy, well, he just moved to Maryland, but he was in Georgia for years. But he does editing for small mags, and he'll write me and say, "Hey, send me some stuff for the upcoming issue." I'm like, okay, sure.
Okay, so you have people calling and asking for your work, but I know that hasn't always been the case, because we all have to start somewhere. So
yeah.
For those who are, listening and wondering, I want my work out there, where do I go from here? How would you suggest they start? Where would you say they send it first?
I almost hate to try and give that advice.
I know.
Well, not so much. I think the market has changed so much now.
That's true.
You got to remember, when I was starting, there was no real internet. I mean, there
Mhm.
was in the abstract, but not in reality. It was because I went through a lot of small presses, that kind of thing. I would say the best thing to do to really start is, and especially in the poetry market, is go to readings, go to open mics, and see what kind of feedback you get. And people, so I had, well, it was funny because when I was teaching in Puerto Rico, I had one English class and I taught a poetry workshop 1 day a week for it. And I had a young girl, well, young, yeah, she was a senior, but uh, she she wrote this poem, and I told her after, I said, "You got to send this out somewhere because this is real." I said, "It needs a little revision, but the bones here are really good." And I think that really helps is going to more open places, uh, writing, writers groups. I'm a big believer in those. I'm involved in two. I've got the one I facilitate and the other one I'm a member of. Because even those people will say, "Hey, here's a place you can send this that your stuff may fit in." Uh, because a lot of times, and I guess the big thing is, look, and I worked retail sales for a while, and one of the things I found that's interesting, every retail salesman who's good is convinced he'll close every sale. In reality, and I can't remember where I read this, but I read something that said that in retail sales, the best ones close maybe 15% of the time. But you got to go in with that attitude. Yeah, I'm going to close this time. And I think that's the thing when you're submitting, you're going to get rejected. You might as well learn to live with that. In fact, the analogy I loved was there was a woman I knew in Jacksonville that said the job of an artist, any artist, whether it's writing, painting, music, whatever, you got two jobs. You got to be sensitive enough to find the material worth recording, but you got to be tough enough to take rejection and criticism. So be ready for it. So yeah,
Yes.
that's good advice. But I would say, look, you never know. You might send something out, and the editor's just he had an argument with his kid that day. He's upset. You never know what's gonna. I would say one of the things I do and I do it on paper. I just refuse to do this on the computer, but I keep written records basically on file cards of everything I send out and where it's
Mm.
been sent. And once it's rejected, I just kind of draw one line through it, but enough so that I can see, okay, I've already sent it to this person. I'll try something different. And also look at the rejection letters, because when you get a letter that says, look, we liked what happened here, that makes it evident they read the piece, but they just didn't take it, then they're interested in getting your work again. When you get the standard letter, thank you and go away. All right, fine. I won't bother again. Or maybe I will if I think I can fit in. But, when I get a rejection that says, it's just this one piece, we liked what you did here and here, but it just wasn't fitting with our editorial flow this time. That to me is an invite. You're saying, okay, you're welcome in my work again, and I will keep you in mind. Uh, but yeah, I think now, of course, anybody writing now, I would say Submittable is a great website. Uh, there's a Facebook page called Submitting Your Art, Poetry, Prose, Art. And there's a couple of people, I wish I could remember their names now, and I can't remember. There's two women who run a blog post monthly where they basically laundry list contests, and calls coming up, and it'll give you a thumbnail sketch of, it'll tell you that. I really love the way they do it. And it'll say right away, for Canadian writers only. Okay, so I know I don't have to look at that one. They'll tell you any disqualifiers right up front. Uh, this guy's looking for gothic horror, this one's looking for romance. So you don't have to waste your time going through every call. And I keep an account with Duotrope. I don't know if you're familiar with that website. You do have to pay for it, but it's very versatile in terms of winnowing down. But I really think Submittable is a great site because you can kind of close in on certain categories pretty easily. Uh, and it is free. You just have to register and get an account. Duotrope, like I say, you do have to pay for them, but I don't mind it. I figure $50 a year, I'll take the chance. Uh, but but yeah, there's a couple of websites that are very good sources for that now, and I would say go to those. Like I say, if you go to Facebook, you got a Facebook account, you just type in submit. I guarantee you'll get about 10 sites that are, and you just winnow down. All right, this one looks good. That one looks good. Uh,
Yeah.
so
Are there any like red flags that you would say, hey, maybe stay away from these kinds of places?
um, not really. I think you got to make up your own mind on that. Like I say, I now avoid like the plague unless they're going to pay very well. I'm not going to get an entry fee, or unless it's a contest, and I think
Yeah.
maybe I got a good chance. But there's so many things now. One of the contests that I'm involved in are, every year this guy charts. It's a guy north of here. Uh, he lives in Newhall, and he's called the Poetry Superhighway, and he runs a contest, and it's just gearing up now. It ends in October, and I usually enter a bunch of stuff. He charges $1 a poem. So for every poem you send, you pay $1. But the way he does it on the prize money is he keeps none of the money himself. The whole pot is then divided among the top 3 place winners.
Oh.
So the first place gets the bulk of it. But the other thing he does, and I do this every year with him too, is you can be a sponsor for the contest, and anybody who enters will get at least one prize. And it's usually in the form of somebody, a free book, or I had one, and this is kind of funny. One year I won a workshop session with a local poet, and she ended up becoming a very good contact for me because she worked with, as we were talking, she worked with veterans of PTSD using writing as a therapy thing. And as we talked, she found out, well, I'm a veteran. I'd written about this stuff. So she got me to do a workshop with her one time. She invited me to, whenever there were military style readings, like for Memorial Day or Veterans Day, she would say, hey, you want to come show up? And I think those platforms are great for getting your name out there, if nothing else. Uh, Hell, the first time Chuck and I played, we did an open mic, and one of the women there came up afterwards. She says, look, I sponsor a thing every month, up in this museum. I'd love to have you guys come be the feature. So I was like, oh, great. Just doing that 1 or 2 bits on the open mic got us that gig. Uh, so, yeah, I think that's a good sort of source, too, is because of the open mic. Look, if you're going to try and get published, you're probably going to have to read at some point. You might as well get used to that.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah,
like
there's
you
a lot
said,
of good sources now. But let us say, when I was starting out, geez, I mean, actually, it's funny because my first really published piece was something that I didn't even know was out there. And I still, the only thing I could figure is that I was at the university and I got a phone call from a publisher in Oregon. And he said, look, we've got this piece you wrote about. There's a poet named William Everson, who was very interesting character from the 60s and 50s, and really kind of the anti-beat. And that's what always interested me with it. He had been in a monastery. He was Brother Antonius, I think was his monastic name. And his stuff was deeply rooted in not just religion, but nature. And I found his stuff very interesting. And they said, well, we got this thing you wrote about his one book we'd like to use. And I said, you realize that's an undergraduate paper, right? And he goes, hey, we don't care. It works well, because they were putting together a collection of work about this particular writer. I said, absolutely, and they sent me a copy, and I was very pleased with that. But I was like, I didn't send this on. The only thing I could figure is the instructor I wrote it for must have sent it in my name, and which was kind of weird. You think, well, you'd think you'd at least let me know.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I'm not going to argue. I was like, oh, look at this. I got a piece published. I wasn't even looking for it. And that's the other thing on submissions too. I can't tell you how many times I've, because normally in poetry, especially, they're calling for anywhere from 3 to 7 pieces, and 5 is pretty much the norm. And a lot of times, I'll send this piece, and then I got one more slot. Let me throw this one in there. I'm not real happy with it, and then sometimes, yeah, that's the one that gets taken.
You just never know. I mean, you miss all the shots you don't take. I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, there you go. That's what it boils down to, really.
Yeah. Oh, I have really enjoyed hearing, like, the constant thing that I keep hearing is, you take the chances
Yeah,
and you create a network. Like, you have such this network that has just put itself in place, and you've embraced those relationships. And I think that's a huge part of being a creative, that you have to have, your writing groups and your mentors and your teachers that you've bonded with and
yeah,
that kind of thing. Like, I love to hear that because, creativity, yes, it comes from one person sometimes,
yeah,
but
yeah.
good gracious, it doesn't have to be a Lone Ranger journey.
And yeah, and I think you got to find the groups you're comfortable with.
Mhm.
Like my approach for me, I want the feedback. I don't need
Mhm.
help in the writing. I'll do the writing. What I need help in is the revision and the feedback on it. So yeah, a lot of times I go to these groups. Oh well, we'll talk for a few minutes, then we'll do a writing. No, that's not what I'm looking for. I don't need that. It's interesting. By the same token, I'm not one of those people, and not to say that it hasn't happened on occasion, but I don't feel comfortable trying to write on the spot.
Mm, mhm.
Unless the prompt is very well directed. But
Mhm.
oh, write a poem. What? You know, you don't just produce that out of thin air. I got to have material there to work with
Yeah.
it. And now, if I got material, yeah, that's going to help. Like the ekphrastic stuff, I like doing that once in a while. But once again, the artwork has to strike me.
Mhm.
Uh, if I don't get a vibe off it right away, it's like, well, I'm not gonna force anything. Uh, so yeah, the creation part, to me, that's solitary, but the
Mhm.
getting it out there, that's communal. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. All right. So, what is the one piece of advice or encouragement that you want listeners to walk away hearing? If they hear nothing else, what do you want them to hear?
Well, in terms of writing or in terms of overall?
Whatever you think they
Uh,
need to hear.
yeah, I guess overall, I mean, I'll use this as an example. But I would say the overall advice is, don't put too much pressure on yourself.
Mm.
Uh, you know, uh, when I was teaching here again in the high schools, and by this time I'm 43, 44, or something like that. And I remember one of those seniors, a girl I had in one of my classes, she's talking to me. She's, I feel so useless. I said, well, what's wrong? She says, well, I don't know what I want to major in. I said, I got news for you. I didn't go to school till I was almost 40, and I changed my major 3 times. So if I couldn't figure out life at 40, don't, put that expectation on yourself at 17 or 18. That's just go do what you like doing, see what you fall into. And if you don't like it, and that also, I think, is one of the things I find now, even because I continue teaching, even though officially I'm retired, but I'll teach a class once in a while. One of the things I found is the younger students have to do it now. Whereas the older students, if I tell an older student, look, I think you're not ready for this, maybe lay back, take a preliminary class, and they're usually willing to look at it. No, I got to have this. It's like, you got plenty of time. Don't worry. If teacher tells you maybe you're not ready for it, it's not coming from a place of evil. It's saying, I'm looking at what you're doing, and I think you'd be better served, dropping back a little bit. And it's interesting because I heard a very good analogy about this in sports. Was somebody was talking about Carl Lewis, being such a great runner, and but they said if you looked at Carl Lewis, he always started slow. You watch him halfway through the race, he starts catching up, and then by the end of the race, he's ahead. Well, he said his secret was, I only run at 85%. I don't start full bore right off the bat because you burn yourself out. If I just keep an 80,
Mhm.
85% tempo going, it's going to help me. And that was a guy doing 100 meters. So, and life is a hell of a lot longer than 100 meters. So
Isn't that the truth? Yes, and that is, I think we live in such a fast-paced world anyway,
mm,
like, everything is, instantaneous. I blame the microwave, like, that's where we started. No, not really, but,
yeah.
everything would just became,
Although
we need
in
it
defense
now.
of the microwave, I will say I think it's the greatest invention of my generation. Uh,
Yes.
because if you ever saw what a frozen dinner was like before 1970s, oh my God.
No, I
God
am not arguing.
bless.
I don't think it's a bad invention at all, but I think it
Yeah.
definitely changed. There was a mindset that came with it that, hey, we need to be able to do things
Yeah.
faster. We need to move things
Instantaneous.
forward. Yeah. And now it's all in the palm of our hand and it's
Yeah.
so fast. And we
Yeah. And it's
see.
too bad. Yeah. Well, I'm a
Mhm.
big baseball fan. I love baseball. And I kind of understand what I don't know if you know the new rules changes are going on,
Mhm.
but I was just talking to a friend of mine yesterday because he's in Atlanta, so of course the Braves are doing great, and I had to call him after they beat up on the Mets like they did this past week. Uh, yeah, I said you should be ashamed of yourself. I had to call every Mets fan I know and invite condolences. But yeah, we were talking about that. I said, yeah, I said they're changing the game to try and attract more people, but the problem is they're trying to attract people who probably aren't going to be there anyway. And all you're doing is upsetting people like us who prefer the game the way it was. Yes, it's slow paced. Yes, it takes time, but it's not. Football's a whole different thing. Hockey's a whole different sport. I love them both, but they're different sports. And what I love about baseball is that sort of long-term strategy you're dealing with, not the instantaneous.
Yes.
Yeah, I
And
think
that's
you do
exactly
have a
what it
real
is.
point there, though. I mean, this idea that I got to have everything within 3 or 5 minutes, or I've lost the audience. Oh, well, that's too bad. I mean, in that case, I'm going to risk losing some people. But although my work is generally not that long, but you know, if you're not willing to invest some time, and I really say it started earlier than that.
Mm.
I always loved. I think it was the 1980s when the movie 2010 came out, and that was off of the 2001. I remember I was taking a film class at the time, and my film teacher said, "Yeah, 2010 is the instruction manual for people who didn't get 2001." But yeah, I think that's something like now. You look at Oppenheimer's out now; it's 3 hours. People, oh God, I got to sit through a 3 hour movie. I said, yeah, but if it's done well, that doesn't matter.
And you'll sit on your phone. Well, I won't. 5 hours is
But
a long time, but you scroll for 5 hours easily during the
oh
day.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
yeah. Mhm.
yeah. But it's and here again, it's that instant dopamine hit,
It
which is
is.
interesting too. I always love that because I have to say I have a cell phone, but really it's only because of my son.
Right.
It's if there's a medical emergency, I need to be able to get contacted and this sort of thing. Otherwise, I really hate them. In
Mhm.
fact, I call them electronic leashes. Uh,
Mm.
and I always say, I read somewhere they said, well, people when they when the cell phone goes off, their first reaction is, "Oh, good, I got to find out what." I said, "Boy, it's a good thing they didn't ask me because my first reaction is, oh, what do you want now?"
Seriously.
And it's like, and I think I've had the cell phone now for several years. I mean, once pagers went out, I had to go with the cell phone. Okay, fine, I'll get the cell phone. Of all the calls I've ever gotten, I would say maybe 3 a year are that important that I needed to take them,
Yes. And now
if
it's
that.
the single ding, it's a ding and it's a text message. And usually it's like from
Yeah.
one of the subscription services I have saying, "Hey, are you still interested in?" It's not even personal
Oh, I
anymore.
know. Yeah. Well, yeah, now the robocalls are invading the cell phone. It's like, oh, great. I can't get away from you guys no matter what I do.
Oh my gosh. Well, what else do you want to talk about? We've run the gamut.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Of course, always willing to talk about my books, but
Well, yeah, tell us what's up next, how we can connect with you and your work. Yeah, tell us
yeah.
about that.
Well, the most recent one I just came out with it's actually a collection of short stories. Um, very short. It's only like I don't know how many stories, maybe 8 to 12 in there. Um, but the title of it comes from one of the stories, which many of the stories, of course, are really my own, but just fictionalized. But it's called The Commies Come to Waterton. And here again, it's about the Vietnam protests and stuff like that. So that one, but like I say, I'm really happy with this last poetry book. And in fact, I'm working with the same publisher now on a new book, which will be creative nonfiction stories of my own. The only hang up right now is I have two pieces I want to include, but one of them has already been taken by an anthology, and they say, look, please don't publish it in your own book until we come out with ours. I said, okay, fine, I'll honor that. So that may get pushed back till the end of the year. But yeah, the one I just came out with, and here I'll hold it up. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's called Just a Little Cage of Bone. And it's essentially, well, I'm an old man. I'm looking back at life. and I've been really pleased with that. That's a guy out of Arizona does this. And I really love the way he works, and I love the way he puts them out and that stuff. But yeah, let's say I've got 4 poetry books out. I now have the short story collection, working on the nonfiction, have the memoir, the personal memoir out. Like I say, that's in the hands of a couple of editors now to go through it. Because I told these guys, I said, look, take a machete to this thing. I ended up writing, well, it's a memoir, which is typically 70 to 85,000 words. I have 155,000 words on that thing, which, and anybody who watches this may guess, is I have a standard joke is, how they're always saying we have ways of making you talk. With me, it's getting me to shut up is the problem. But yeah, like I say, I've got the books of poetry out. I really enjoyed the one, I did one called This Just In, and it's, the subtitle is A Poetic Journal of News Stories, Fake and Otherwise. And it's essentially dovetailing off my previous work in journal, working on newspapers and that sort of thing. That one also does have illustrations with it, which was fun.
Did you do them?
No, it was actually, here again, these are these calls for ekphrastic poems based on artwork. And I was really pleased with them. And I said, I want to put them. And this, now here you want to talk about a luxury. When I was sending this one out, I had a couple of publishers that were interested in it, but they said, but we don't want to do the artwork. I said, well, no, I'm sorry. That's an integral part of this work to me. And I said, isn't this interesting? For once, the writer is refusing publishers. That rarely ever happens.
Did you feel powerful? I would have felt very
powerful. It was great. It was fun. Yes. And then one of them was willing to go with the pictures, but they wanted to do in black and white. And I was like, no. And then I found these guys actually out of India. Cyberwit is the name of the company. I'm really happy with the results. But like I say, I kind of fashioned it after a newspaper where I grouped the poems kind of like, all right, the first section is always news, then there's the editorials, and sports is at the end, and entertainment. And I kind of did that very loosely. So that was fun to do. But yeah, this last one, that's Just a Little Cage of Bone, I'm very happy with, and such a deal at $9, I think, because what the guy is charging for it. So it's also the cheapest book I have out. So. Nice.
And where can we find it?
Actually, if anybody Amazon, if you just go under my name, Bill Cushing, as a writer, they should show up. But also feel free to post my email, and if anybody would like signed copies, we'll work out a deal. Depending on where they live, to cover the postage and stuff. I'm not looking to make money on that, but I also don't want to lose money on it.
Right. Very good. Well, all of that, and I'll make sure all of that is in the show notes so that, after or during listening, you can go click on that and be like, this is what I want. No, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. And thanks for hanging out and having this conversation.
No,
I know that anybody listening, they will walk away with something. And I know it's going to be a game changer for whoever hears it, because, the voice of experience, the voice of wisdom, the voice that comes with age and just living life,
Yeah.
For we don't need to tune that out. I know that we get distracted by those little devices, those little leashes that
Yeah.
we carry around with us, but to actually hear the voice of experience and to take its advice, I think we could
Yeah.
learn a lot.
And of course, experiences, I've always defined it as it's what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. Uh, but
Mm. We could unpack that one for a
yeah,
while.
that's, but yeah, I think, yeah, the having taken this trip and gone down this road, I feel more organized. I feel more comfortable in my own skin. You know, when I first started, I was just shotgunning stuff all over the place. And it wasn't until later I learned, yeah, you got to kind of look at some of the past publications, look at what else they've done, you know, make sure you fit them. Otherwise, and that's the thing is if you don't fit that publication, you're just wasting their time, and it's very unlikely they're going to hear from you again.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that you have nowhere to go. It's
Yeah.
just
Oh
not the
no,
right
no.
spot
Oh,
for
the
you.
market is so wide open now. By the way, that also this new book on the nonfiction one I'm working on of the short nonfiction pieces. The title is called Time Well Spent. And
Mm,
it's all stories starting from my infancy up to, well, the most recent one would probably be with my son, some events with my son, with because when you're dealing with disabilities,
mm.
there's a lot of sad stories, but there's some really funny ones too. And the thing where he sort of went against everybody's expectations one time and just blew everybody's
Oh.
mind.
And I am certain that there have been plenty of moments where you thought this was time well spent.
No, yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bill, thank you again.
All
And
right.
I just look forward to following you and seeing what's up next for you on your journey. I have no doubts it will be a wild ride.
Well, hopefully.
Well, thank you. I hope you have a lovely evening.
Oh, thanks much. And I will catch up with you before too long, I hope.